The crystal spires of Lux sparkled like diamonds against the purple sky as James Miller's shuttle descended through the atmosphere. His hands gripped the armrests tighter than necessary. This wasn't his first diplomatic mission, but it was certainly the most beautiful and nerve-wracking one yet. "Remember," his automated assistant chimed, "the Luxians communicate as much through their natural bioluminescence as they do through words. Try not to stare directly at their light patterns. It's considered rude." James nodded, though he wasn't sure how he would manage that. Everything he'd seen in the briefing videos had been mesmerizing. The Luxians were humanoid, yes, but their skin held millions of tiny light-producing cells that rippled with colors expressing their emotions and thoughts. The shuttle touched down on a landing pad that seemed to be made entirely of transparent crystal. Through it, James could see complex networks of light flowing like rivers beneath his feet. A welcoming party waited at the end of the walkway, their forms glowing softly in the dim twilight of the planet's longer day. "Just a routine trade negotiation," James muttered to himself, straightening his navy blue diplomatic uniform. Earth needed the unique crystal technology that only the Luxians could provide, and the Luxians had expressed interest in Earth's agricultural methods. Simple enough. As he walked toward the greeting party, one figure caught his attention. She stood taller than the others, her light patterns shifting in gentle waves of blue and gold. Unlike her companions who wore elaborate crystalline robes, she was dressed in what appeared to be a simple flowing garment that enhanced rather than hidden her natural luminescence. "Welcome to Lux, Diplomat Miller," she said, her voice carrying a musical quality that reminded him of wind chimes. "I am Lady Rose of the House of Dawn." Her light patterns brightened slightly as she spoke his name. James bowed, remembering his training. "The honor is mine, Lady Rose. Earth sends its warmest regards to your people." A ripple of light patterns passed through the assembled Luxians. James couldn't read their meanings yet, but he noticed several of them exchanging glances. Lady Rose's patterns shifted to include hints of purple, which quickly faded back to blue. "Please," she gestured toward the massive crystal palace behind them, "join us for the welcome ceremony. We have prepared a traditional gathering to mark this historic occasion." As they walked, James couldn't help but notice how the ground beneath them responded to each Luxian footstep, sending out small ripples of light that matched their personal patterns. His own steps, however, seemed to absorb the light, leaving momentary shadows that quickly filled back in. He caught several of the Luxian diplomats watching this phenomenon with great interest. Inside the palace, the effect was even more pronounced. The walls themselves seemed alive with light, responding to the emotions and movements of everyone within. James felt like he was walking through the northern lights, surrounded by shifting curtains of color and light. "Your arrival is most timely," Lady Rose said as she walked beside him. Her patterns had shifted again, now including swirls of gold that seemed to reach toward him. "Our houses have been anticipating an event of great significance." Before James could ask what she meant, they entered a vast chamber where hundreds of Luxians waited. Their combined light patterns created a spectacular display that danced across the crystalline surfaces. At the far end, a group of elderly Luxians sat on what appeared to be thrones made of pure light. "The Council of Light awaits," Lady Rose announced, but James caught an unusual tone in her voice. Was it excitement? Anxiety? As they approached the council, James noticed something odd. The shadows he cast seemed to form patterns of their own intricate designs that made the surrounding lights dance and swirl in new ways. The council members leaned forward, their ancient faces illuminated by their pale blue glow. One of them spoke in a whisper that somehow carried through the entire chamber. The shadows danced with him, just as it was foretold. Lady Rose's patterns flared briefly with brilliant purple and gold. Another Luxian, a male with storm gray patterns, stepped forward with an expression James couldn't quite read. The entire chamber seemed to hold its breath. James had the distinct feeling that this was no longer just a routine trade negotiation, and he was right. His life was about to change in ways no Earth diplomatic training could have prepared him for. The formal dinner that evening was unlike anything James had ever experienced. The dining hall's crystal walls pulsed with soft light that matched the rhythm of quiet conversation. Food was served on plates that seemed to float on cushions of light, and the dishes themselves glowed with different colors to indicate their ingredients. James sat between Lady Rose and a stern-looking Luxian official whose light patterns stayed a constant stormy gray. He couldn't help but notice how Lady Rose's patterns had shifted to deep purples and golds throughout the evening, especially when she glanced his way. The shadows he cast continued to create unusual effects, making the lights around him dance in ways that drew constant attention from the other diners. "Tell me, Diplomat Miller," Lady Rose said softly, her voice carrying that musical quality that made his spine tingle, "do you believe in prophecies?" Before James could answer, the elderly head of the Council of Light stood, causing all conversation to cease. The ancient Luxian's patterns glowed with a pure white light that commanded attention. "Honored guests," the council head began, his voice resonating through the chamber. "Tonight we witnessed the fulfillment of the prophecy of shadow and light." He gestured toward James with a luminescent hand. "For 10,000 years, our people have awaited one who could make the very light itself dance with shadow." James felt his throat go dry. This definitely wasn't in any of his diplomatic briefings. "Our most ancient texts speak of a time when two great houses would be united by one who walks between light and shadow," the council head continued. "One who creates patterns in darkness itself." Lady Rose's patterns flared brilliantly, and she stood. "My House of Dawn claims the right of union," she announced, her voice clear and strong. "The shadows cast by our honored guest create patterns that match our house's ancient cycles." Suddenly, the stern-looking Luxian beside James rose as well. "The House of Dusk contests this claim." His gray patterns now sparked with angry red highlights. "The prophecy speaks of shadow, which is clearly more aligned with our house." James looked back and forth between them, finally understanding why his simple trade mission had felt so strange from the start. "Excuse me," he said, standing carefully, "but what exactly does this prophecy require?" Lady Rose turned to him, her pattern swirling with gentle blues and purples. "It requires marriage, Diplomat Miller. Our houses have feuded for centuries, and the prophecy states that only a union with one who walks between light and shadow can bring lasting peace." James sat back down rather quickly. "Marriage," he squeaked. The council head nodded solemnly. "The signs are unmistakable. Your unique interaction with our world's light is exactly as foretold. The only question that remains is which house has the stronger claim." Around the table, Luxians began taking sides. Some pointed out how James's shadows created patterns similar to the House of Dawn's ancient symbols, while others argued that his ability to create darkness itself clearly aligned him with the House of Dusk. Lady Rose leaned close to James, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I know this must seem overwhelming, but please understand. This goes far beyond mere tradition. The tension between our houses has been growing for generations, without a resolution." Her patterns flickered with worry. "Civil war," the stern Luxian, who James now knew represented the House of Dusk, stated flatly. "The prophecy was meant to prevent it. Now that you're here, there must be a choice." James tugged at his collar, feeling the weight of hundreds of expectant eyes upon him. His diplomatic training had covered cultural sensitivity, trade negotiations, and even crisis management, but nothing about accidentally becoming the subject of an ancient alien marriage prophecy. The council head raised his hands for silence. "The choice cannot be made tonight. Diplomat Miller must be given time to understand our ways, and both houses must present their claims properly." His patterns shifted to a formal green. "For now, he will be given quarters in the neutral crystal spire, where both houses may court him according to our traditions." As the dinner drew to a close, James caught Lady Rose watching him, her patterns forming complex swirls of gold and purple that seemed almost hopeful. Despite his shock, he found himself fascinated by the way her light seemed to reach out to him, creating beautiful patterns where it met his shadows. One thing was certain. This was going to be the most interesting diplomatic mission in Earth's history. James paced in his crystal chamber, watching his communication device flash with increasingly urgent messages from Earth's diplomatic corps. The device's screen reflected off the transparent walls, creating small rainbows that his shadows somehow turned into intricate patterns. Even his anxiety was apparently prophetic on this strange world. "What do you mean you're in an alien marriage prophecy?" His supervisor's voice crackled through the device. "This was supposed to be a simple trade mission." "I know, sir," James replied, running a hand through his hair. "But refusing might trigger a civil war between their noble houses. The last thing Earth needs is an unstable Lux." "Well, you can't marry an alien. Think of the diplomatic mess. The paperwork alone would." The supervisor's voice cut off as another call came through. "Diplomat Miller." It was Lord Ash of the House of Dusk, his gray patterns now visible even through the small holographic display. "I trust you've had time to consider the historical significance of shadow in Luxian culture." James tried to keep his voice steady. "Yes, Lord Ash, your morning presentation was very thorough." He didn't mention that the 3-hour lecture on shadow symbolism had nearly put him to sleep. "Excellent. Then you understand why the House of Dusk is the only logical choice. We have prepared the traditional courtship chambers and—" A soft chime interrupted the call. Through his chamber's wall, James saw Lady Rose's distinctive gold and purple patterns approaching. Her light cast warm shadows that seemed to dance with his own. "I'm sorry, Lord Ash, but I have another appointment," James said quickly, ending the call. The truth was, Lady Rose's visits were the only times he felt less like a diplomatic incident and more like himself. She entered with a gentle pulse of light that made the room feel warmer. "I brought you something," she said, holding out what looked like a crystal flower. "It's a dawn bloom. They only grow in the deepest caves where light and shadow meet." James took the flower carefully. Where his fingers touched it, the crystal seemed to come alive, creating a display of light and shadow that filled the room with beautiful patterns. "The council is pressing for a decision," Lady Rose said softly. "Lord Ash has been arguing that the House of Dusk's claim is stronger because they've traditionally governed during our night cycle." James set the flower down on a nearby table, watching as it continued to react to his presence. "And what about your house's claim?" "The House of Dawn believes that true balance comes from embracing both light and shadow, not just one or the other." Her patterns shifted to include hints of silver. "But I—" She hesitated, her lights dimming slightly. "Yes." James found himself stepping closer, fascinated by the way their shadows mingled on the crystal floor. "I would make the same offer even without the prophecy," she said quietly, her patterns swirling with emotions he was starting to understand. Before James could respond, an urgent chime filled the room. The wall displayed a message that made his heart sink. Earth's diplomatic courts was sending a ship to remove him from the situation. "They don't understand," he muttered. "If I leave now, both houses will see it as a rejection. The political balance here is so delicate." Lady Rose's patterns flashed with concern. "The prophecy speaks of choice freely made. If your people force you to leave, then both houses would have reason to blame each other for the failure," James finished, "and Earth would lose any chance at an alliance with Lux." He looked at the dawn bloom, still creating its beautiful dance of light and shadow. Then he looked at Lady Rose, whose patterns had become a soft, worried swirl of gold and blue. Finally, he looked at his reflection in the crystal walls, noticing for the first time how his shadows seemed to create patterns that complemented the Luxian lights instead of fighting them. "I need to send a message to Earth," he said firmly. "And then, if you're willing, I'd like to learn more about how your house's council meetings work. If I'm going to prevent a civil war by getting married, I should at least understand what I'm getting into." Lady Rose's patterns brightened with hope, but James held up a hand. "I haven't made my choice yet," he said carefully, "but I will make it myself, not because Earth orders me to leave, and not just because of some prophecy." The patterns his shadow cast on the wall seemed to agree, forming shapes that looked almost like the ancient Luxian word for destiny. 3 days into his Luxian marriage crisis, James found himself sitting cross-legged on a glowing floor, trying very hard not to accidentally insult anyone. Lady Rose sat across from him, her patterns shifting between amusement and patience as she taught him the basics of light pattern communication. "No, no," she said gently, trying not to laugh. "When you move the crystal that way, you're not saying good morning. You're announcing that you've lost your shoes in a bet." James groaned and set down the light-focusing crystal he'd been given for practice. "How do your people learn all these patterns as children? There must be thousands of them." "We begin learning from birth," Lady Rose explained, her patterns forming teaching symbols that danced across the walls. "It's like your human facial expressions, but with more possibilities." She demonstrated by making her patterns spell out a simple greeting. James tried to copy her movement with his crystal, but somehow managed to cast shadows that translated to something about racing fish. A group of young Luxian servants passing by burst into fits of giggles, their patterns flickering with mirth. "At least I'm entertaining," James sighed, but he was smiling too. Despite the political pressure and the looming decision between houses, these lessons with Lady Rose had become the highlight of his days. Later that afternoon, Lord Ashe insisted on teaching James about the House of Dusk's traditions. The stern Luxian led him through the darker parts of the Crystal Palace, where shadows held more meaning than light. "You see," Lord Ashe explained, his gray patterns rippling seriously, "the absence of light is just as important as its presence. Watch how your natural shadows interact with our sacred spaces." James had to admit it was fascinating. In these chambers, his shadows created complex designs that seemed to tell stories on the walls. But something felt off about the way the House of Dusk wanted to emphasize darkness over light. "Balance," he muttered to himself, remembering Lady Rose's words about her house's philosophy. That evening, a formal dinner nearly turned into a diplomatic disaster when James accidentally used the wrong crystal to eat his soup. The resulting light pattern apparently suggested he wanted to challenge the entire House of Dusk to a traditional dance competition. "I accept," declared an elderly Dusk member before anyone could explain the mistake. His gray patterns sparked with competitive excitement. Lady Rose quickly stepped in, her patterns forming soothing waves of blue and gold. "Perhaps we could turn this into a cultural exchange," she suggested diplomatically. "James could demonstrate a traditional earth dance, and we could show him ours." What followed was possibly the first ever combination of human waltz steps and Luxian light pattern dancing. James found himself trying to lead Lady Rose in a simple box step, while she created beautiful swirls of light that followed their movement. Their shadows cast patterns that made even Lord Ashe's stern expression soften slightly. "Your people's dances are very physical," Lady Rose commented as they turned across the floor. Her patterns showed curiosity and something else, a warmth that made James's heart beat faster. "And yours are beautiful," he replied honestly, watching the way their combined movements created art on every crystal surface around them. "I never thought shadows could make light more beautiful instead of just blocking it." A soft murmur went through the watching crowd. James had accidentally stumbled upon an important piece of Luxian philosophy, the idea that opposites could enhance rather than diminish each other. Later that night, back in his chambers, James recorded a message for his Earth supervisors. "The more I learn about Luxian culture," he said, "the more I realize this isn't just about a marriage prophecy. It's about finding harmony between different ways of seeing the universe." He looked out his window at the twin moons of Lux, one bright and one dark, casting interweaving shadows and light across the crystal landscape. Somewhere in the palace, both houses were still arguing about their claims to the prophecy, but James was starting to see beyond their surface differences. His own shadow stretched across the floor, no longer just an absence of light, but a partner in creating something new and unexpected. much like a human diplomat learning to dance with patterns of light and darkness on an alien world. It was during his late-night wandering through the Crystal Palace's library that James made the discovery. He had been studying ancient Luxian texts, trying to better understand the prophecy that had turned his diplomatic mission upside down. His shadows cast strange patterns on the crystal shelves, making certain books seem to glow in response. One such book practically jumped out at him, its crystal pages lighting up when his shadow touched them. It was old, far older than the prophecy texts he'd been shown before. As he carefully opened it, his diplomatic training kicked in, and he noticed something odd about the dates. "This can't be right," he muttered, comparing it with other documents. The so-called ancient prophecy about light and shadow seemed to have appeared in Luxian records only about 50 years ago, right when the tension between the houses began to worsen. A soft pulse of light announced Lady Rose's arrival. She often found him during his late-night study sessions, but tonight her patterns showed unusual nervousness. "You found it," she said quietly, looking at the book in his hands. Her patterns swirled with a mix of guilt and relief. James looked up at her. "The prophecy isn't ancient at all, is it?" Lady Rose's patterns dimmed slightly as she sat beside him. "No," she admitted. "The original was more of a philosophical text about balance between light and shadow. It was adapted when our houses began their serious conflicts." "Adapted?" James raised an eyebrow. "You mean someone rewrote it to force a marriage alliance?" "The council did," she said, her patterns showing frank honesty. "They hoped that by creating a prophecy about an outsider who could bridge light and shadow, they could prevent our houses from tearing our world apart." She paused, her patterns shifting to deep blue. What they didn't expect was that someone would actually appear who could make shadows dance with light. James sat back, processing this information. "So when I arrived and my shadows created those patterns, the council thought it was a gift from fate." Lady Rose's patterns flickered with a hint of amusement. "They had created a prophecy about the impossible, and then you arrived doing exactly what they had described." "And the house's claims?" James asked, though he was beginning to understand. "The political situation is very real," she said seriously. "Our houses have been on the brink of civil war for decades. The prophecy was meant to force a peaceful solution." Her patterns suddenly showed uncertainty. "But my feelings, they weren't part of any prophecy or political plan." James looked at her closely. "When did you know? About the prophecy being created, I mean." "I found out just before you arrived," she admitted, her patterns swirling with remembered emotion. "I was angry at first, at the deception, at being part of a political game. Then I met you, and—" her patterns shifted to the warm gold and purple he had come to associate with her true feelings. "And you still played along with it." He wasn't angry, just curious. "I had to," she said. "The peace between our houses is fragile, but I promised myself I would tell you the truth before you made your choice." Her patterns showed clear sincerity. "I didn't want to win you through a false prophecy." James stood and walked to the crystal window, watching the play of moonlight on the palace grounds. Below he could see members of both houses going about their evening duties, their patterns marking them as clearly as uniforms would on Earth. "Actually," he said slowly, "this might be exactly what we need." Lady Rose's patterns showed confusion. "What do you mean?" "The council created this prophecy as a tool for peace, right? But they based it on an ancient philosophy about balance." He turned to her, excitement building in his voice. "What if we could use the truth to create something better than what the false prophecy intended?" Her patterns shifted to show interest and curiosity. "You have an idea?" "I think I do," James smiled. "But we'll need help from both houses, and surprisingly, from Earth too. Tell me, what do your people know about human diplomatic treaties?" Lady Rose's patterns brightened with understanding. "You want to create a new kind of alliance." "Better than that," James said, watching their combined light and shadow patterns dance across the library walls. "I want to show both houses that the real prophecy was the philosophy they forgot. That true strength comes from balance, not from choosing between light and shadow. Her patterns glowed with hope and something more, something that made James's diplomatic heart race with possibilities. James stood before the combined council of both houses, his heart pounding but his voice steady. The crystal chamber was packed with members of both the House of Dawn and House of Dusk, their patterns creating a tense light show across the walls. Lady Rose and Lord Ash sat at opposite ends of the council table, watching him intently. "Honored Council," James began, "I spent weeks studying your prophecy, your customs, and your philosophy, and I've come to understand something important about light and shadow." He paused, letting his own shadow cast intricate patterns across the floor. "They cannot exist without each other." A murmur ran through the crowd, patterns flickering with interest and confusion. "The prophecy speaks of one who walks between light and shadow," James continued. "But I've learned that on Lux, nothing is ever just one or the other. Your whole world is built on the dance between them." He gestured to the crystal walls around them, where light and shadow created endless patterns. Lord Ash's patterns showed skepticism. "What exactly are you suggesting, Diplomat Miller?" "I'm suggesting a new interpretation of the prophecy," James said, pulling out the ancient philosophical text he and Lady Rose had found. "One based on your oldest writings about balance. Instead of choosing between houses, what if we created something new?" He activated his communication device, projecting Earth's diplomatic seal onto the crystal walls. Where the projection met his shadow, it created stunning patterns that combined both houses' traditional symbols. "On Earth, we have something called a cultural exchange program," James explained. "I propose we create a new institution, a joint council between both houses, dedicated to maintaining balance. My marriage would not be to a single house, but to the idea of unity itself." Lady Rose's patterns brightened with understanding. "A permanent alliance between houses, with Earth as a neutral partner." "Exactly," James nodded. "The prophecy doesn't have to end with a simple marriage. It can begin a new era of cooperation." He turned to face the council. "Think about it. The House of Dawn's expertise in light technology, combined with the House of Dusk's mastery of shadow applications. Earth's resources and diplomatic connections supporting both." Lord Ash leaned forward, his patterns showing genuine interest for the first time. "And how would this joint council function?" James smiled. "Like the daily cycle of Lux itself, with both light and shadow taking their natural turns, working together instead of fighting for control." He waved his hand through a beam of light, creating shadow patterns that danced across the chamber. "Your prophecy spoke of balance. Let's create it together." The chamber erupted in discussion, patterns flashing as council members debated. James caught Lady Rose's eye across the room. Her patterns showed pride in something warmer, something personal beyond political maneuvering. An elderly council member stood, his white patterns commanding attention. "This is unprecedented," he said slowly. "But then again, so is a human who can make shadows dance with light." "The original philosophy this prophecy was based on," James added carefully, knowing he was about to reveal its recent creation, spoke of finding strength in unity, not division. "Whether the prophecy is old or new doesn't matter. What matters is that it brought us all together to find a solution." The council chamber went silent. James held his breath, wondering if mentioning the prophecy's true age would destroy everything. But then Lord Ash stood, his patterns showing resignation and, surprisingly, respect. "The House of Dusk recognizes wisdom in this proposal," he announced formally, "even if it comes from unexpected sources." Lady Rose stood as well, her patterns bright with hope. "The House of Dawn agrees. This solution honors both the letter and the spirit of the prophecy." The elderly council member looked around the chamber, taking in the mixed patterns of both houses. "Then let it be so," he declared. "A new council will be formed, bridging light and shadow, Earth and Lux." He turned to James with an expression that might have been a smile. "And as for your marriage, Diplomat Miller." James felt Lady Rose's patterns reach out to touch his shadow, creating a beautiful display that made everyone in the chamber gasp. His diplomatic training hadn't covered falling in love while preventing an alien civil war, but some things, it seemed, worked the same way across the universe. The day of the ceremony dawned with both of Lux's sons painting the Crystal City in colors James had never seen before. His diplomatic quarters had been transformed into a preparation room, where representatives from both houses worked together to dress him in ceremonial robes that combined their traditional styles. The crystal fabric they draped over him was neither purely light nor shadow, but a remarkable material that seemed to capture both. When he moved, it created patterns that rippled between the symbols of both houses. His Earth diplomatic pins had been carefully attached, marking this as not just a marriage, but a historic alliance between worlds. Earth's diplomatic corps still can't believe you turned a potential civil war into an interplanetary cultural exchange program, his supervisor said through the communication device, shaking his head but smiling. You'll probably be teaching this case at the academy for years. James adjusted his robes, watching the patterns shift. Sometimes the best diplomatic solution is the one nobody expects, he replied, thinking of how far they'd come from his first terrified reaction to the prophecy. The ceremony space had been created in the heart of the Crystal Palace, where the architecture of both houses met. The walls were alive with light and shadow, creating endless dancing patterns that reflected the excited mood of the gathered crowds. Members of both houses sat together, their mixed patterns creating beautiful displays that would have been impossible just weeks ago. Lord Ashe stood at the front of the chamber, his usually stern patterns now showing hints of gold among the gray. As head of the new Joint Council, he would conduct the first part of the ceremony. James had to hide a smile, remembering how the former rival had become one of the strongest supporters of the new alliance once he understood its potential. The chamber's patterns shifted to announce Lady Rose's arrival. She wore robes similar to James's, but hers seemed to capture and enhance the natural light patterns of her emotions. Right now, those patterns showed joy, love, and just a hint of mischief that only James had learned to recognize. We gather today, Lord Ashe began, his voice carrying through the chamber, not to fulfill an ancient prophecy, but to create a new future. His patterns showed approval as he glanced at James, acknowledging the humans' role in transforming their society's expectations. The ceremony combined traditions from all three cultures. James and Lady Rose exchanged Earth-style vows, their words creating light patterns that the crystal walls captured and reflected. They performed the traditional Luxian bond dance, their shadows and light patterns weaving together in ways that made the older council members whisper about true prophecies and fate. When they reached the part about joining houses, James and Lady Rose turned to face the crowd together. We pledge ourselves. They spoke in unison, not to a single house, but to the balance between all houses, to the partnership between worlds, and to the truth that diversity brings strength. Their combined patterns at that moment, James's shadow-casting abilities and Lady Rose's natural luminescence, created a display that would be talked about for generations. The entire chamber lit up with a perfect blend of light and shadow, forming images that spoke of harmony, balance, and something entirely new. The Earth representatives attending virtually sent their congratulations, already excited about the trade and cultural possibilities this union would bring. The houses of Dawn and Dusk celebrated together for the first time in living memory, their patterns creating unprecedented beautiful combinations. Later, as they stood on a balcony overlooking the Crystal City, Lady Rose's patterns shifted to the private colors James had come to love. "Did you ever imagine," she asked, "when you first arrived for that simple trade mission, that you'd end up preventing a civil war and revolutionizing our society?" James watched their shadows dance together on the crystal floor. "Actually," he smiled, "I was more worried about learning all those light-patterned greetings without accidentally challenging anyone to a dance competition again." Her patterns sparkled with laughter, the sound like music to his ears. Below them, the city glowed with celebration, light and shadow working together to create something more beautiful than either could achieve alone. "So," James said, taking her hand and watching their combined patterns create new designs on the walls, ready to show the universe what humans and Luxians can accomplish together. Lady Rose's pattern swirled with love and excitement. With you, always. And as the twin suns set on their wedding day, their shadows and light continued to dance together, writing the beginning of a new story, one that would be told on both their worlds for generations to come.